Hello, this is Scott Dahman of PowerWorld Corporation. In this session, we will learn how to use the Model Explorer and the case information displays in PowerWorld Simulator to view and edit text-based data. The Model Explorer is a container that encapsulates most of the case information displays. A couple exceptions include the area zone owner filters, which we looked at in a previous session, and limit monitoring settings, which we will look at in a future session. The Model Explorer provides a way to navigate through most of the data that's in the model, and it's accessible from a few places within Simulator, as shown here. From Simulator, click on the Application button and then choose Open Case. And then inside the Sample Cases folder, or the Training Cases folder, if you have one, choose the case called b7flat.pwb and then choose Open. If you have an existing case, you can choose to save it if you wish. I can open the Model Explorer from a few different places, as mentioned on the earlier slide. One place is on the Case Information tab, and then on the ribbon it says Model Explorer. Inside the Explorer, the two tabs on the left are the Explorer tab and the Options tab. The Explorer tab arranges each of the objects in PowerWorld Simulator in a series of folders. The Network folder shows things like branches, buses, generators. Aggregation shows control areas, and there are several other folders as well. The Options tab provides access to several ways of modifying or customizing the display. If I select a different object type to explore from the Explore pane, such as generators, I can click on it and then see a listing of the generators in the spreadsheet type form right here. I can do the same for loads and other objects as well. And each time I select a new object type, it'll open a new tab inside the Explorer. Very similar to what you see with tabbed browsing in Internet Explorer version 7 or in Firefox. So I can switch from object type to object type of the recently opened views just by selecting the tab. And if I get too many of them open at one point and want to close one, I can just click on the X. The slide here shows the different components of the Model Explorer. Looking at the Explorer pane, and then on the right, the actual case information display, which is embedded inside the Model Explorer. The Explorer pane contains basically 8 folders for easy navigation. So the network and the aggregations are the ones that are most commonly used, and those views are expanded by default. And each of those folders you can expand or collapse by clicking on the plus or the minus sign that appears next to the folder. Items that are grayed out represent object types that don't have any data in them yet. So for example, if I click on the DC transmission lines, this particular case doesn't have any DC transmission lines, so it's empty. And the cue over here that it's empty is the fact that it's grayed out. And again, the Options pane provides access to commonly used options, which will change the appearance of the case information display to the right, and the recent tabs along the top show recently viewed case information displays. The Model Explorer contains a couple of embedded toolbars which provide access to some commonly used functions. Now back in Simulator, I'm going to expand this window a little bit so that we can see everything along the top. Here along the top is the case information toolbar, and down at the bottom is the search toolbar. Now these can be changed, the position can be changed, or these can be docked in different ways if you like. And a lot of these same options that you see on the case information toolbar can also be accessed by right-clicking in the case information display, or by looking at the Options tab over here on the left. And in this session we'll go through a lot of these different options and the functionality. Simulator has a similar construction for the one-line diagrams called the Display Explorer. This is similar to the Model Explorer, except for it contains information on objects that are displayed on the one line. It gives you a way basically of navigating through the graphical information on the one line using a tabular form. Back in the B7 flat case, if I switch to the one-line diagram from the list of open windows over here on the case information toolbar, and I choose the B7 flat one-line diagram, then I can click the One Lines tab on the ribbon, and then the List Display, and then All Display Objects. And this opens a Model Explorer for the objects that are on the one-line diagram. So I can look at the display buses. These are basically all the objects arranged by type. And I can also open specific case information displays just for certain objects, such as buses and generators. And then the case information display shows information on the graphical objects that are on the one-line diagram. I'll go ahead and close that. And then the slide also shows an example of the Display Explorer and some of the functionality that you can get from it. A lot of things are similar, such as the case information toolbar and the search toolbar, and then there's also a way to save the display information to a text file format called the display auxiliary file, which we'll talk about a little bit later. The text displays housed within the Model Explorer are called case information displays, and these show the power system model data in a tabular or spreadsheet type format. And basically every type of object that can be represented inside the PowerFlow case has its own case information display. Commonly used things include buses, generators, lines and transformers, loads, areas and zones, and there are a lot of other less commonly used case information displays available as well. So this slide shows the Model Explorer with the generator case information display opened inside it. Case information displays are mostly accessed from within the Model Explorer, and a lot of simulator dialogues also have embedded case information displays in them. Things that you can do include finding certain objects or searching for text strings. You can sort the display on one or more fields. You can filter the display according to advanced criteria. You can copy and paste it into a spreadsheet like Excel or OpenOffice. You can do contouring of columns and a lot of other different options as well. There's also an option to create a custom case information display, which we'll cover at the end, where you can determine exactly which type of objects and exactly which objects, like certain generators or certain branches, that you can integrate into a single view or a single display. There are a set of options in Simulator for customizing the way the case information display appears. From the Options ribbon tab, we select Simulator Options. And then on the left we choose the case information displays. This dialog gives you the option of changing the color scheme of the different types of fields which can show up in the case information display. Basically, they're color-coded so that fields that are enterable show up as one color. Fields that are toggleable, such as fields that could have a yes/no value or an open/closed value, are shown in another color, and so forth. And then there's also a series of checkboxes that you can optionally show or hide different things. You can change the row height, use word wrap for long headings, highlight key and required fields. We'll talk a little bit more about those later. And there are options for how things get copied to the clipboard or sent to external applications like a spreadsheet. And the slide here describes some of the other features that are available on the case information display options. And this color scheme slide here again describes some of the different field types that you can set separate colors for. And then also the background colors in the case information display. There are a couple of default schemes that you can select that are especially well suited for light backgrounds or dark backgrounds. If I click the light background option, it basically gives me the same set of colors that I began with. Or I can click the dark option as well. That'll change the background to a black, and then the other colors will change accordingly to look good on black. So it's really just a matter of personal preference. If you're using a large projection screen, sometimes the dark background looks a little bit better because you don't have all the white space in the background. I'll go ahead and change it back to the light colors. And the slide shows what the light color scheme looks like and what the dark color scheme looks like. Here's a shot of the embedded case information toolbar on the slide, along with descriptions of several of the icons that you can see along that toolbar. And we'll go through most of these options in the rest of this session. The first button is the Show Dialog button, and what that'll do is it'll bring up the dialog for the active object that you've selected in the case information display. So in Simulator, I'll close this window and go back to my case information display, and I can pick a particular load record from this list, for example, and then choose the Show Dialog. And then that'll bring up the dialog box for that load. And I can see how much power, real power and reactive power are present in that load, and several other options which are specific to that object type, to the load. The next option is the display column options. And if I open that, I can choose which fields are shown on the display. So this is the load case information display again. I can see on the left a list of all of the available fields for loads. And most of these are also grouped inside certain categories too. So for example, the area group, I can expand that, and I can choose the area name that the load's bus belongs to. If I want to show that on the display, I can drag it over here onto the right. And each of these are also color-coded. The green ones represent strings, the red ones represent integers, and the blue ones represent floating point. And again, if there's a field that I want to display on the case information display, I can just click it and drag it over to the right. I can also use these add and remove buttons to include things on the display or to take them off. And I can also change the order by selecting an item on the display and moving it up or moving it down. You can see that the order changes over here when I move, for example, the MVA field up or down. And then I can also click and drag and then drop where I want that field to be. There's also a checkbox for highlighting the key fields and the required fields. And if I check that, I'll see that some of these fields have become color-coded with yellow or green highlighting. The yellow fields basically represent the key fields. Those are the fields which uniquely identify each record. So for the load object, the key fields are the number of the bus and the load ID. Each one of those must be unique. You can have multiple loads at the same bus if you want, but each one would then have to have a unique ID. So basically the combination of the bus number and the load ID must be unique for every load in the system. And that's a scheme that's followed by all industry standard PowerFlow software, such as PowerWorld Simulator, PSSE, and PSLF. I can also see several fields here in green which are denoted as required fields. And these are fields that have to have data populated in them for any time you add a new object to the power system. So for example, the status, which is either open or closed, that refers to the breaker status for the load, must be specified. It has to be either opened or closed. It cannot be some null value or unspecified value. And the constant power megawatts and the constant power megabars also must be shown. If I scroll down here to the bottom of the available fields on the left, I can see that there's a grouping for key fields and for required fields as well. So I can make sure that those fields are shown on my display if I want. Fields that are shown already on the display are shown in gray over here on the left. So if it's gray on the left, that means it's present over here on the right. I can also look at my required fields. All of those are shown. And then there's also a tab for the secondary key fields. And in most cases, this refers to a secondary way of referencing a bus. The default or the primary key for referencing a bus is always the number of the bus. And that's an industry standard. So in the PowerFlow case, you can't have two buses with the same number. In PowerWorld Simulator, we also provide an alternate or a secondary key for buses, which is the name and the nominal kV. And basically this allows you to use a heuristic for matching up data from one case to the next, or for one-line diagrams as well, which we had covered in the previous topic. So if I add the name and the nominal kV to the display, and I kind of drag this away, what I can see is I get a concatenated field which shows the bus name in an underscore and then the nominal kV with 2 digits to the right of the decimal place. And this is basically a string field, and it's just an alternate way of uniquely identifying the buses. It's not strictly unique though in the way that it's enforced. In other words, you could have in your case 2 bus 2s with the text TWO as the name and nominal kV of 138. Simulator would not prevent you from doing that, nor would other PowerFlow packages. Basically the number is the only thing that's strictly unique, but the name could be used as an alternate way again of matching things up, like one-line objects or things from an auxiliary file from an old case that you want to transfer to a new case where the bus numbering may have changed. Another cue that's shown on here relative to the key fields is in parentheses you will see, if it's a primary key field, you'll see a number in parentheses. So the number of the bus here has a 1 in parentheses, which basically means that that is part of the primary key. The load ID also has in parentheses the number 2, which identifies it as part of the primary key. But the ID also has in the parentheses the letter B. It has actually the 2B in parentheses. And the B refers to the fact that it's part of the secondary key field, along with the name and the nominal kV of the bus. That has the A in parentheses. So what that means is if you want to use the primary key in order to uniquely identify records, be it for importing data or for saving, exporting data to a text file format, which we'll talk about a little bit later, then you do need to include the key field. If you want to use the primary key, then you need to include all of the fields with the number in the parenthesis. If you want to use the secondary key, then you would have to include all the fields that have the letters. And again, if you look at the left, at the available fields on the left, it'll tell you what the primary key fields, the secondary key fields, and the required fields are. Another thing that can be done from here for numerical fields is you can change the number of digits that are shown in the field. So for example, if I go to the MVA field, I can change how many digits are shown to the right of the decimal place. And this will update once you close the dialog. I can change the column width as well, but things like that are often easier to do outside of this dialog. You can actually do it directly in the case information display itself, and we'll show that in just a minute. Another option is you can choose how many columns you want to freeze in the display, and this is very similar to what you might see in a spreadsheet. By default it is set to 1 because the actual row numbers is considered the first column. But if I change that to 2, for example, then it will freeze the second column as well, so that if I scroll over here to the right in my case information display, this column will always be visible. The second tab inside this dialog is called the Display Options tab, and if you click on that, you can change the row height if you want of this particular display. You can tell it that you want to use a custom row height, which would be one that's different from what is specified in the simulator options that we looked at earlier. So if I wanted to, I could change the row height to say 20. I kind of see what that does. I can change the font if I want to. Instead of the default Tahoma font, I believe it is, you can change that. And then you can specify this as the default if you make some changes if you want. You can also choose whether or not to use your area zone filters. So you could choose to ignore the area zone filters in this particular display if you want. Or you can choose to apply an advanced filter to this display here, which we'll look at in just a moment. And then you can also change the zoom level, which by default is 100%, but if you want to change that, you can do that as well. There's also an option for automatically sizing the column widths, and that will basically just change the columns so that they're only as wide as they need to be to hold all the data. The slide shows a few more details here about what I just described, and how some of the things that you can access on the Display Column Options dialog can also be accessed from other toolbars that appear on the Case Information toolbar that's shown along the top. So on the Display Options tab, you can access the advanced filters also through this button, and you can auto resize from this button on the toolbar. And if I switch back over to Simulator, I can see these toolbars here. So the very next one over is the automatically size columns, which I just did. You can also manually size columns by floating the mouse over a column boundary and then clicking and dragging. So you can stretch it or compress it as you prefer. And then I can auto size it back. If it is a field that has digits, I can change the digits by increasing them or decreasing them accordingly using these buttons right here. There's also a button along the bottom of the Display Column Options tab that shows up on both tabs for resetting the current case information display to the factory defaults. And if you click that, that will revert all of the things like the row height and the area zone filters back to their defaults, and it will also reset the actual fields that show up on the display to their defaults. And you can also save the settings if you make changes out to an auxiliary file, which again we'll talk about later, but basically what that does is it sends settings to a text file that you can later recall at a different time within that case, or even in a different case entirely. The next option, or the next function as we move to the right, is the Find button, and if I click on that, it'll bring up this dialog, which we've seen a similar dialog in a couple other places before, where we can look at a list of all of the objects that are shown in the display. And we can optionally choose to use the area zone filters to filter this list or to ignore them. And I can sort by name. That'll give me an alphabetical sort on name, or by number. And I can choose one from the list, or again I can type and it'll jump to that point in the list. And again, I can use wildcard characters here just like I could in similar displays that we've seen. So when I find the object that I want, I'll click OK, and then it jumps to that particular line in the case information display. And the slide here shows that dialog and then its different components. The next slide shows some things that you can do with the wildcard characters, the asterisk and the question mark, and some examples of what would get selected with different strings that include the asterisk and the question mark. The next function is the Search for Text button, and that differs a little bit from the Find in that the Find is searching for a particular object, like a particular load object that's specified by either the number or the name that you type in. Find will basically, Search for Text rather, will look for a particular string anywhere within the case information display. So it's very similar to that type of functionality that you find in a spreadsheet. So for example, I could call it up and then type in the word top and then tell it to search for the next, and it'll actually jump anywhere in here where it finds the word top. I could put in a number too, like 136, and it'll jump anywhere it finds basically the string 136, either in a string or in a number. It'll jump to that. And you can use wildcard characters here too. You can tell it to search by rows or by columns, and you can tell it to match the case. So if you have a uppercase or lowercase string in here, it'll only find matches that match the exact case that you've specified. Or you can tell it to find the string as the entire contents within of a cell rather than a substring inside a cell. And you can tell it to ignore any filters that you have, so it'll look at records that are not filtered. And you can tell it also to search all of the fields, not just the fields that are shown on the case information display, but also some of the ones that we elected not to show on the display. And this search functionality is also accessible through the search bar at the bottom. So if I type in a string and then tell it to search now, it'll jump to that string. And I can change the options, the search options as well, from this drop down. And the slide here shows that functionality where you can get it from the dialog or from the search bar at the bottom. And the next slide describes in a little bit greater detail some of the options that you can apply to the search. For objects that are attached to one or more buses, there is also the option of opening the case information or the bus view for the bus that object is attached to. So for example, on the load here that's attached to bus 4, if I click on the bus view on line, it'll open the bus view on line for bus 4 as shown here. The next item is a drop-down list called Records, which allows you to do things like insert or delete certain records, and then also bring up things like the quick power flow list, bus view one line, the area zone owner filters. Some of these options may be particular to the object type that's shown in the case information display. And the slide here describes some of the commonly available choices from the records menu. So you can insert and delete objects, bring up the bus view or the substation view, and so forth. It's also worth noting that in order to view the insert or delete options, you have to be in the edit mode. If you're in run mode, then insert or delete will be grayed out because you can only take these actions if you're in edit mode. Another function that's available under the records drop-down is the define expression. And I'm going to go ahead and switch to my buses object type along the top here. And it's also worth noting that you can get a lot of these same options by right-clicking in anywhere in the case information display. So I can show the dialog, go to the display column options, insert or delete, and then here's basically the records drop-down list right here. So it shows the define expression, and if I choose that, it'll bring up another dialog for defining expression. So the first thing I need to do is click the new button to set up a new expression. Then I want to choose the fields that are going to be part of the expression, and then down at the bottom I'll define a mathematical function which describes the expression as a function of up to 8 different variables. And I can optionally give it a name as well. So for the name, I'm going to call it net generation. And then in the X1 field, to choose the field, I'm going to click Find, and that's going to bring up a dialog very similar to what we saw earlier on the display column options for where you select the fields that you want to show on the display. So I'll expand the generators group and then choose megawatts, and then click OK. And the other thing I need to add is the load megawatts as well. So I'll expand loads, choose megawatts, and then click OK. And then I'll click in the space down here at the bottom, and then I'll put in my expression. In this case, it's going to be very simple, x1 minus x2. And that will give me generation minus load. And then I'll click OK. And it's going to ask me then if I want to add that expression to the case information display. And I will click yes. And then what it does is it adds a column then for my net generation, and then the CE just designates that as a custom expression. But now it shows the value at each bus of the generation minus the load. And the process is also described on the slides. So to create a custom expression, you click New, and there's a couple other buttons on there which I didn't describe, which are explained right here. In addition to the simple addition and subtraction operators that you can use inside your function, here's a more complete list. So you can use things like trigonometric functions, you can use logical operators or comparators or parentheses to group the order of operations, and so forth. More details are available in the help file as well. The next drop down over to the right is for geographic data views. It says Geo, and if I touch it, I can access the geographic data view option, which will be discussed a little bit more in a later training session. In order to use these options though, you do have to have complete latitude and longitude information for your buses, or at least for the buses of interest. That information must be populated in the records. The next drop down to the right is the set options, and in order to use these you need to be on a field that is either toggleable or enterable. In this case I'm on the custom expressions, so it doesn't show up. But for example, if I switch back over to my loads, I can see that the status is a toggleable field. It shows up as green and it's closed. So I could click on the set and then I could toggle everything to be open, for example. And that changes everything in my display. So things that are filtered out of the display because of the area zone filters or because of the advanced filters, which we'll talk about in a moment, are not going to be changed. But everything that is on this case information display will be changed. So I can toggle them all back. If it's a numeric value, I also have the option of setting all the values to. And I could type in a constant. Say I wanted to change all of my loads to 50 megawatts. I could just type that in and then click OK. I don't actually want to do that, so I'll hit cancel. But anytime you want to change an enterable field to a certain value, then that option is available. And another option on the set menu is to set all of the values to a particular field. And rather than typing in a constant as I did with the set all values to, I can specify a different field. And then what that'll do is it'll grab the data out of the other field and then populate the field, the column that you selected with the values from that other field. And that's described here on the slides as well. And as I mentioned, the actions that you apply to the objects are only applied to those that are shown on the display. Anything that's filtered off the display will not be affected by anything that you do from the set menu. There's also another way to set the values of one field to be equal to the values that are in another field. In addition to using the set menu, you can also go into a particular field and just type in the @ symbol and then the variable name. This actually has to be the variable name, not the common heading. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But if you use the @ symbol and the variable name, for example, here we're changing the generator voltage set points in the generator record to just be equal to the present value or the present voltage. So if you type in the @ bus per unit volt, it's going to reference the field right here, bus PU volt. And that'll be set to 1.05 when you hit enter. And again, this is referencing the variable names. When I look along the top here, I'm seeing headings that are kind of what I'll call the English headings. They're spelled out with spaces and they're easy to read. But Simulator also internally keeps a set of variable names which you can access if I go to the Simulator options up here on the options ribbon and I go to case information displays. I can choose right here in the column headings to use the variable names instead of the normal headings. And then if I click OK, then I'll see the variable names. And these are basically the internal names again that Simulator uses. And these are the names that you have to reference if you want to set a value equal to the value in another field, as described on the slide right here. And what this is useful for is you can then embed a string like this into an auxiliary file or when you're exchanging data from Excel. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Excel exchange in this training session, and a separate session we'll talk about using the auxiliary files. Now, one thing to keep in mind too is when you're in Excel, you might need to add the single quote before the @ symbol, or else Excel is going to think that it's some sort of function that involves the @ symbol. We'll also talk later about how to get a reference of a complete list of all of the variable names that are available in Simulator, as well as all the object names. The next set of functions to the right in the Case Info toolbar is the Columns menu. And there are several options that are available there. You can select all of the items in a particular column or row. you can get column metrics, which we'll talk about in just a minute. This gives you a quick view of statistical information such as the sum and the standard deviation of all the numbers that appear in the selected columns. You can also contour columns and plot columns, and that basically pertains to numerical data. So get column metrics will show things like the sum, the average, the variance, standard deviation, min and max of the numbers that are in the selected columns. So over in Simulator here, if I go to the columns and then get column metrics, and I do it from the load column. First you have to select a cell in the load column if you didn't do that already, and then call that option up from the columns, the columns menu, and it'll show for all of the loads that are in the display, the sum of the loads, the average, and so on. You can also apply this function by selecting multiple columns or just certain cells on the sheet as well. If I close this, I can, for example, click and drag on a series of cells that span rows and columns, and then I can go back in and do the same thing, and it's going to show me a different set of numbers that pertain only to my selection. I can see up here what my selection is in terms of the start column and the end column. Those are just numbered sequentially. And then the same thing for the row. Starts in row 2, ends in row 4. I can change those values up here if I want. And then once I make a change, I can tell it to update the metrics. And it'll give me a new set of numbers based on that selection. And then there's a couple other options here which are pretty self-explanatory. Columns can also be contoured. Numerical columns can be, at least. If I just click on a single cell in the load megawatt column again, and then go to the columns contour column, it'll bring up the contouring dialog, which we're going to study a little bit more in a different training session as it pertains to one-line diagrams. But for right now, I'm just going to accept all of the defaults. It's basically giving me a map right here where it's showing the high value is mapped to red, and that's 185, and the middle or nominal value mapped to green is 126. I can change these numbers if I want, and I can also change various color contour maps to different color definitions. But again, we'll discuss that a little bit more later. For right now, it's sufficient to just click OK, and then you can see what it does is it applies the coloring to the cell, which depends on the value that's in there and how it relates to the map. This slide provides a little bit extra detail on contouring the columns, and then here's a display of a larger bus records with contoured columns. And then the last option underneath columns is plotting, and if I select that, it'll just bring up a graph. Basically along the bottom it's showing me the number of the load as it's shown in order on the display, and then on the vertical axis it's showing me the load megawatts. And there's different options I can use. I can plot, instead of using the sort number, I could plot, for example, the MVA along the bottom versus the load, and that's just going to organize the data in this XY plane. And you can just kind of play around with this if you're curious. There are different things that you can add to the vertical axis depending on what the numerical fields that are shown on the display are. And then you can also change the min and the max and things like that. And the slide here shows an example of generators in a particular case being plotted, their maximum megawatts being plotted against the sort number. So it just shows that you've got a bunch of generators with small outputs, and then you've got a few that have some large output as well in the case. Another case information function is the area zone owner filters, And these are global settings that apply to all case information displays. We looked at these a little bit in the Midwest.raw case when we were selecting which objects to put on the one-line diagram, and we filtered down to just show the Illinois power area. A little bit more information about how that works is shown here. The area zone owner filters can be used to limit what's shown, and in order for something to be shown on a case information display, its area must be set to shown or toggled to yes. The zone must be set to shown, and its owner must also be set to shown. And over in Simulator, I can bring open the area zone owner filters by floating over this icon right here, which is a couple icons over to the right where we were looking at before with the columns. And then it will open the area zone owner filters. I'm going to go ahead and change my variables back. It looks like I'm still showing the variable names from what I was illustrating earlier. I'm going to change back to the normal headings by going into the simulator options, then to case information displays, and then back to normal headings. Then I'll click OK. So I can see the area tab shows all the areas in the case, and if I want to ignore everything that's in area left, for example, I can just double click on that to toggle it to no. And I could do the same thing with zones. There's only one zone in this particular case, and there's only one owner as well. But if I want to filter some out, then I can. And of course, within the area zone owner filters itself, there's also this case information toolbar that shows along the top. So I can open some of the same features that I did before. I can toggle everything to yes or no using the set drop down, and just about everything is also shown if I right click in the grid. I can access these different options as well, like the set and the toggle all yes, toggle all no. A lot of the same options. There's also the option to set up an advanced filter, and these are object-specific filters that allow you to go even further than what you can with the area zone owner filters. You can filter on any characteristic. Like, for example, I could look at all the buses that have a per unit voltage less than 1.0. I could create an advanced filter for that, and then it'll show only the buses in my case information display that meet that filter. So back in Simulator, I will close the area zone owner filters and then click on this next button, which is for the advanced filters. And I don't have any created yet. That's why all this is grayed out. And then I'll click on the advanced filter, and that'll bring up that dialog. So here my object type is load. So it's dropped me in the load filters. I can also go to this drop down list and create an advanced filter for other object types as well. But I'll go ahead and leave it on load since I'm in load records. And I think what I'm going to do here is create a filter that shows only the loads that have megawatt greater than 100. So the condition right here, the first thing I need to select is a field or fields. And if I click the drop down here, I will see every field that is shown already in my display. So the next thing over to the right is a comparator string, and the list of options here might vary a little bit depending on whether you selected a text field or a numerical field. So if it's a text field, for example, you'll have string operators, so you can specify that the string contains something or so on. For numbers, it's got things like greater than or less than, equal to, between. So I'll go ahead and use greater than, and then I'll type in 100. And there's a couple other options available here too. I can use an absolute value flag, which would then take anything that has an absolute value greater than what I specify here. I can enable the checkbox that says enable field-to-field comparisons will allow me, instead of putting in a constant right here, I could compare the value to the value that's inside another field. And then I could choose that field here. I'm just going to leave it at a constant and select loads that are greater than 100 megawatts. Another thing that you can do is, by default, it's limiting the fields that are shown in this drop-down list to those that are shown already on the display. If I want, I can also tell it to show all of the fields. So if I select that, I'll get a much longer list now in my drop-down, which could be good, but if you want to keep it simple, it might be good just to limit what's on there. But of course, if you're trying to filter according to some field that's not already shown on your display, then you'll need to show all of the fields. I can also have this filter pre-filter using the area zone owner filters. If that's set to, if that box is open, then it'll basically just show all of the loads in my case that meet this filter, regardless of whether or not they also meet the area zone owner filters. So when I'm ready, I'll go ahead and click filter, and then I can give it a name. So I'll just give it a simple descriptive name of type in greater than 100 megawatts, and then click OK. And you can see it removed the loads that had 40 megawatts or so from the list. So once I create an advanced filter, I can go back to the advanced filter button right here and click the little arrow, the drop down arrow next to it, and I can remove the filter if I want, but I can also see that it added to my drop down here the name of the filter which I just created, the greater than 100 megawatt. So if I had more than one, I would see everything in here that pertains to the loads. So I'll tell it to remove the filter, and it'll put that one load back in there. And the 80 also, it looks like it put back in there. And I can right click, or I can go back to the filter there, go into the advanced filter, and I wanted to show a couple other characteristics of this. So for my filter name, I can create a new one, or I can go back to my filter that I already created. And another thing that you can do is you can add conditions. In addition to this simple the simple filter that I had, where I was just looking at loads that had megawatts greater than 100, I can also add another condition, as many as I want. I can click the Add button and then select another condition, say megavars greater than 10. And then once I have more than one condition, then I can use a logical comparison here. I can and these two conditions together, I can OR them together, or I can not AND them or not OR them together. And if I add a condition and then decide later that I don't want it in the filter, I can just click the X and that'll remove it. The slide here shows an example of an advanced filter being created for a bus. And there's some descriptions here which show the various options. There's 3 conditions that have been added here, and again you can click the box, or you can click the delete button and then select specific condition numbers to delete. For some object types, you can also basically borrow the filters that are defined for related objects. So for example, if you've got a bus filter that only looks at buses with nominal voltages greater than 138 kV, you can also apply that to generators as well. And in Simulator, if I go back to my advanced filters, I can see where that's done up here. So the advanced filters for load, I might be able to apply a bus filter as well. In this case, I don't have any bus filters defined, but if I did have some, I could choose it, and then for some types of filters, I could then apply it to the load. So basically it will show the loads whose terminal buses right here meet the bus filter that you select. Again, there's no maximum number of conditions that you put, but you can only select one comparator for a single filter. So if you want to create a complex filter that basically maybe has 2 or 3 conditions that are ORed together, and then that combination is then ANDed with another condition, the way you would do that is you would have to create multiple filters. So you'd set up, say, filter A, which would OR a bunch of conditions together, and then maybe another filter, filter B, which might OR a couple other conditions together, and then you could set up a third filter, filter C, which would reference filter A and then AND it with filter B. So, and again, you can optionally pre-filter using the area zone owner filters, or you can ignore them and just show the objects which meet the advanced filter. And then this slide describes a little bit again about the logical comparators that are available, and then other options such as the absolute value comparator. For strings, there's also a case-sensitive comparator, field-to-field comparisons, or referencing actually another filter. So in the example I provided where you wanted to use the complex logic, you would have to actually reference another filter inside the filter. And this slide shows how field-to-field comparisons can be used. And then the following slide shows again how complex logic can be applied by creating different filters that represent the different comparisons, and then using another filter within a filter to create the more complicated construct. And one caution too, if you're going to do that, make sure you don't have circular references. In other words, don't have filter A reference filter B and then filter B reference filter A. That'll cause some errors. Case information displays can also be sorted just by clicking on the column that you wish to sort by. So back in Simulator, I could click, for example, on the megawatt field in my loads, and it's going to sort it by ascending megawatts. The arrow pointing up basically tells me that it's sorting in ascending order. If I click the same field again, it'll then sort in descending order. If I want to sort by a different field, I can just click the different field. Text fields will be sorted then alphabetically, either ascending or descending. And if I want to remove a sort that I've applied this way and just get back to the default sort, I can just click up here in the upper left where the row headings and the column headings meet, and that'll take the sort off. At this time, I'm also going to remove the advanced filter that I applied just by going to the advanced filter drop down and then click remove filter. And I'm also going to take this contouring off just to clean this up a little bit. So I can go into the set toggle columns and then go to the contour column and then click remove. That'll take it off. So the simple sorting that I just demonstrated will allow you to sort either by ascending or descending order the list of records based on a single field. So you can sort by, in this case, generator megawatts, or you could click on any of these other fields. If you want to do a sort based on multiple fields, you can do that as well. It's called advanced sort. And we open it up also on the case information toolbar. So in Simulator, I'll go over here to where it says sort, and if I float the mouse over, I'll see that it says advanced sort. And then here I can specify the fields that I want to sort on. So, for example, I could sort first by megawatts, and then I'll make that ascending, and then I could sort as a secondary field by the megavars. So if there's basically any ties in terms of two loads that have the same megawatts, it'll then sort those out by megavars. And I can add as many conditions by clicking on the Add button. I can delete conditions. I can sort ascending or descending. I can use absolute value, and so on. So I'll go ahead and click Sort. And then once I do that, it puts a couple different arrows on. A larger arrow to represent the first field, or the primary field that it's sorted on, and then smaller arrows to represent any other fields that it's sorting on. And just like with the simple sort, if I want to remove it, I can just click where the rows and columns intersect, and it'll remove the sort and return it to the default order in which the records are displayed. So the slide basically describes the steps. You can choose the columns that you want to sort on. You can make it ascending or descending. You can put as many different conditions or columns in as you want. And you can use absolute value or case sensitive for the string conditions. You can also save the information in the case info display to a text file format. The simulator text file format is called the auxiliary file, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next training session. But for now, the options that you have are save to the auxiliary file, all records and columns, and basically what that'll do is everything that's on the display here will get saved out to the auxiliary file. You can save only the selected record, which will save all of the columns, but just for the record that's selected down in the display. Or you can save the auxiliary file for only the selected records and columns, which could be just a single cell basically. You know, if I right click on this cell and then bring up the same option from the local menu here, then the selected records and columns would just be that cell. So it would be for load 2, the status column would be the only thing that would be saved. I can also save the data out to a comma delimited CSV file, which is also a text file format, and that could be all of the records or only the selected records and columns. And there's a few other options as well. You can dump the case information display out into an HTML document or to a couple different graphic formats as well, bitmap or JPEG. I can also load data in from an auxiliary file from the next option that's over, just by selecting this. And again, we'll talk more about the auxiliary file in the next training session. You can also exchange data with the Windows clipboard or with different spreadsheet options. If I click this drop down right here, I can copy the selection, which would be just the selected cells, to the clipboard. I can copy all to the clipboard, which would be everything in my case information display. I can copy send special, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. And I can send things also to Excel, everything in the display or just the selection, and the same thing with OpenOffice Calc. And you have to have Excel and or OpenOffice Calc installed in order for these to be not grayed out here. So for example, I could send everything to Excel just by picking this option right here. And it will launch Excel and then put everything in the case information display into the Excel window. So then I'll switch over to Excel here, and I can see what it dumped out was the load records. The top cell, A1, says load records. That basically tells me what kind of data came from simulator. The second column, or the second row rather, shows all of the field names that were in the case information display, since I told it to send everything out. And then the data follow underneath. And if I want, I can use the spreadsheet then to change some of this information and then paste it back. So for example, if I wanted to change the status of the load at bus 4, I could just type in open right here, and then I can paste it back into Simulator and it will actually change. Now, there's a couple rules that you have to follow for pasting information back. And one is that you need to make sure that what's in your upper left hand part of your selection is the object identifier. So in this case it's load records. I can't just copy this cell and then paste it into Simulator because it's not going to know what to do with the data. It first needs to know what object type the data pertains to. The next thing it needs to have is a list of the column headings or the different variables in the second row. And these can be in any particular order, but you do have to make sure that you at least include the key fields, either the primary and or the secondary key. So for example, for loads, it has to be the number of the bus and the load ID. If those fields aren't present, then it's not going to allow me to paste the data back in because it's not going to know how to associate the data that I'm copying with the records that are in the case. So if I make a selection here that at least includes the data that I want to change, the key fields, and the object type, then I can copy from Excel and then switch back over to Simulator. And I can right click in here, or I can bring up the drop down up here and choose paste. And then when I do that, you can see that it changed the data actually for the load at bus 4 with the load ID 1. It changed to open. If I switch back to Excel and I make another selection that does not include the object identifier up here in the upper left, and it does not include my key fields, and I make that selection and I copy it to the clipboard and I switch over to Simulator, if I try to paste the data in by right clicking and then trying to choose paste, I'll see that the paste is grayed out. That just tells me that I don't have a proper selection on my clipboard that can be pasted into this particular case information display. Another thing that I can do with this spreadsheet, as long as I'm in edit mode and I follow all the rules with the key fields and the required fields, I can actually use the spreadsheet to create new records. So for example, I will go over to Excel, and let's say I wanted to add another load at bus 7. One thing I can do in the spreadsheet, of course, is I can copy that entire row and just paste it onto another row. And then what I'll do is I'll change the ID of the load of the new one from 1 to 2. And then I'll also change the megawatts, the constant current megawatts, from 200 to 100, and I'll give it some megavars as well. We'll put in 40. Now I can actually take this new data and paste it back in if I want. I can make my selection in Excel and then choose copy and then come back over to Simulator. I need to make sure that I'm in edit mode if I'm going to paste new records in. It won't work in run mode, or at least it won't add the new record. I can change certain data in run mode, but I can't add a new record. So here I will right click and then I will tell it to paste, and then it pops up a confirmation dialog saying that the load described by 7.2, that is bus number 7 load ID 2, is not defined. It doesn't exist in the case. Would you like to create a new load record from the data read? And I will select yes, and then it will actually add it in. But again, I've got to remember that I always include not only my key fields but my required fields, which are all the ones that show up in green. If there's any doubt as to whether or not your key and required fields are on the display, remember you can go to the display column options and then make sure that your key fields are already shown and your required fields as well are already shown on the display. So on the slides we see here again the different copy and send options. The copy send special allows you to specify things like whether or not you're going to include the column headings on what you send out, and then also whether or not to show the row that has the object identifier, which we talked about quite a bit in Excel. And with the copy send special, you can also choose to transpose the data as well when you copy it either onto the clipboard or send it to Excel. So in Simulator, I can choose Copy Send Special. And I can see I have several different options here. I can tell it to copy to the clipboard or send it to Excel or to OpenOffice. I can transpose the rows and columns. And I can include the object name. That's in this example was the load records and the column headings, or I can exclude them. And for column headings, I can use either the normal headings or the variable names which we looked at earlier. Also, if I want to send something to Excel, and I've already got Excel open, as I do now, and I try to send another set of data to Excel, say I'll switch over to the bus records, or I could even send the load records out again as well, and choose Send All to Excel, it'll pop up a dialog that says, do you want to create a brand new workbook, or do you want to use any of the workbooks that are already open? So if I wanted to just add a new tab to the workbook that I already created, which is called Book 1 in this case, I could choose Book 1 and then say, give me a new sheet within Book 1. Or I could paste it over the existing one. But then I can choose OK. And then when I go to Excel, I'll see that I've got a tab for load records and then one for bus records as well. So the slides also have a lot of summary information about copying and sending things to Excel. And here's the dialog that pops up if Excel is already running. And then you can choose which options to use here. And it's important, especially when you're pasting back in, that you include in cell A1, or at least in the upper left-hand corner of your selection, a description of the kind of data that follows. And then, of course, the fields which follow are very important in that you're needing to include the key fields if you're pasting information back in. So cell A1 in this case is the identifier of the object, and of course it's very important. If you modify it, then it won't necessarily allow you to paste back into Simulator. And then of course the second row shows the fields, which is again is important for the reasons that we mentioned. And this slide has more on the key fields, which we've described a little bit previously. For buses, it generally entails the bus number. For transmission lines, it includes the from number, the to number, these are bus numbers to which the line is connected, and then the circuit ID. So you could have parallel lines between the same pair of buses as long as it has a unique circuit ID. And for loads, of course, which we've been working with, it's the bus number and the load ID. And you definitely need to keep the key fields intact if you want to paste data back into Simulator from the spreadsheet. If you want to get a complete list of object fields, there's a way to do that under the Help. And if we go to the Window ribbon tab, then we can send it out. We can either send it to a text file or we can send it to Excel. Since I've already got Excel open, I think I'll use that option. So in Simulator, I'll choose the Window ribbon and then export the case object fields. And I can send it to a text file or to Excel, assuming I have Excel. I'll go ahead and choose that, and then I'll tell it to create a new tab in Book 1, and it'll be called Object Fields. I can of course change that if I want, and then click OK. And then over in Excel, I can look at the Object Fields sheet that it created, and I can see it gives me a list of basically all of the fields that are in Simulator. It's a pretty big list. If if I go all the way to the end, I can see there's 8,311 rows, which means there's 8,310, I guess, items in the list. Well, not quite that many, because the object, the line where the object appears, is actually blank. But anyway, the object type here is the three-winding transformers. It's got a list of all the variable names, and these are the internal, if I widen this out, these are the internal simulator variable names. There's also a string which tells you what type of data it is, either a real number, a string, or an integer, and then a description. This is a kind of a longhand English description. So this is kind of a dictionary then of all of the object types and variable names that are available in Simulator. And this is very important if you want to work with auxiliary files and things like that, to know how to get a reference like this. Things like the key and required fields are also shown either with an asterisk or a letter or a number, using the same convention that we looked at earlier. So the ones with the asterisks are the required fields, and the ones with the numbers are the primary key fields, and the letters represent the secondary key fields. So you could search, using Excel, of course. I can look and, for example, find bus objects. Just type in bus here, and then I can jump down and see all the fields that are associated with buses. So it's a handy reference just to be able to know where to find that information if you need it. And of course the slides provide more detail on what the key fields are, and the secondary key fields as well. So when you're pasting into Simulator, it's going to first look to see if the primary key fields are available. If they're not, then it'll look for the secondary key fields and use them. And of course, if neither the primary nor the secondary key fields are available, then it will not be able to paste the data back into Simulator, and you'll get that paste being grayed out. And as we demonstrated, you can use the spreadsheet to edit the data, and of course you can use all the math functionality inside the spreadsheet. Just make sure that when you paste the data back in, that it adheres to the format restrictions that we talked about earlier. You can put formulas in too in the spreadsheet, and then what it's actually going to paste into Simulator will be whatever value that formula evaluates to. So if you have an equal sign, and then you're referencing a couple of cells and adding numbers together, you can paste that in. You can then paste the result back into Simulator. So it's very powerful to be able to use the spreadsheet to edit the information that you eventually want to use in the PowerFlow case. And then make sure too that when you're making your selection in the spreadsheet, that it includes the fields that you need. And then you can paste back into Simulator. Another thing to note too, that you can only paste information into Simulator that you could edit anyway. So things like values have to be enterable. Toggleable fields can be changed too. So things like the breaker status being opened or closed, you can change that with the spreadsheet. But things that are not changeable in the graphical user interface cannot be changed in the spreadsheet as well. So for example, this custom expression right here, it's a calculated value. I can't just type a number in. In the same way, I can't use a spreadsheet to change its value. It just won't work. It's got to generally either be blue or green in this case to denote a value that's either enterable or toggleable. And again, you can use the spreadsheet to paste new objects in, provided you follow these rules and provided you're in edit mode. Another thing you have to be careful of is redundant data. Basically, when you're pasting records in from a spreadsheet or from any other external source that uses the clipboard back into Simulator, Simulator is going to take the last data that it reads in. So there's a couple different ways which you could inadvertently be redundant. For example, with bus records, there are two different fields, at least two different fields, that represent voltage. One is the per unit voltage field, and the other is the kV field. They're both enterable in PowerWorld Simulator, but they basically specify the same information. They're not independent of one another. So the per unit voltage is basically the actual voltage divided by the nominal voltage. So if you're copying both sets of data from the spreadsheet back into simulator, the only thing that's going to matter is whatever shows up last. So for example, if I go to simulator and I look at my bus records, you can see I've got my nominal kV and my per unit voltage shown here. I could change one of them, like for example the per unit voltage. Or I'm sorry, I changed the per unit voltage, and the kV voltage here to the right changes based on what I type in. I could also type in a number for the kV volt, and it'll change the per unit voltage accordingly. I could do the same thing in the spreadsheet. If I go back to my spreadsheet tab that shows the bus records that I exported earlier, I could change the per unit volt right here, or the kV volt right here. So for example, if I just type in, let's say 1 per unit volt, but I leave the kV the same, 144.9, and I paste this information, or rather copy this information to the clipboard, and then switch to simulator and paste, what's going to matter is the fact that the second thing I pasted in was 144.9, not that I had a per unit voltage of 1 in. There's other ways you can have redundant data as well. You could have the same, if I copy this first row right here and then paste it at the bottom of my list, I could also be redundant in that I could repeat the information from the same record twice in my list in Excel. And let's say I put in 1.02 per unit volt down here, and then make a selection that includes the first row, which specifies it as 1 per unit volt, and then the last row that specifies it as 1.02. And then I'll copy that to the clipboard, come back to simulator, and then paste it. What's going to happen is the 1.02 that I entered last is going to be what sticks, because it's the last thing that it read in. Simulator is just going to read this selection in from left to right and from top to bottom. So one thing that's very handy is to use the message log when you are pasting data in from an external source, be it from Excel or an auxiliary file or anything else. The log will tell you if it has any errors in pasting data in. So here it tells me that it pasted in 7 records successfully. If that's what I was expecting it to do, then that's good. If there's any errors and anything is not able to paste in, then it will tell you here in the log that it wasn't able to recognize a certain record or wasn't able to paste it in. And the slides here show another example of redundant data. In this case, loads can be represented with a sum of constant current, constant power, and constant impedance values. And then there's also the general megawatt value, which is a function of all those. You can actually go in simulator and change the megawatt value. In doing so, you may end up changing some of these other values as well. But you need to make sure, of course, if you're specifying using Excel or some other external source, that you only use one unique way of specifying all those variables. In the case of loads, it's usually best to use the components of constant power, constant current, and constant impedance to specify those individually, rather than trying to change the value in the megawatt field, because that can create some results that may be unexpected or undesirable. Then also on the case info toolbar in simulator is this options drop down, and that allows you to access things like the display column options, which we've already talked about. You can select whether or not you want to highlight the key fields, so those are the key and required fields here. If I decheck that, then that'll go away. Here I can also switch between normal and variable names in my heading. It's a quick way to do it rather than having to go into the case information options. I can variously show or hide grid lines, header hints. If I show the header hint, then if I float the mouse over certain headers, it may provide some hints. It's not necessarily available everywhere, but for some headers it is available. So the slide shows some more details on some of those options that are available. And then also a lot of the things, as we mentioned, that you can access on the case information toolbar can also be accessed on a local menu by right-clicking. It's usually just a matter of preference, whether you prefer to right-click in the case info display or to select the options along the top on the case info toolbar. There are a couple items as shown here that are available only on the local menu and not on the case information toolbar. One that's particularly handy is this option to explain why a certain field or line is disabled. So if I go into Simulator and I go back to my loads records, I can see that for this load attached to bus 4, it's actually open. The breaker status is set to open. If that's not the case in yours, you can just toggle it by double-clicking it and changing it to open. And I can see that just about everything associated with that load is grayed out. And that's because the load is open, and so it doesn't really matter what the value is. I could go in and change the constant current megawatts from 80. I could type in 100 if I want, but it doesn't matter. Whatever I type in here, I'm still actually going to get 0 megawatts out of it because its breaker is open. In some cases, it may not be obvious to you why a particular field is grayed out. And if that's the case, you can usually find the field and right-click on it, bringing up the local menu, and then choose why is this field or line disabled. And then in doing so, it'll give you a hint which says the load is not in service. So, meaning that the breaker status is open. So that's available most times where you see a gray field. You can usually get an explanation in the local menu as to why it's grayed out. Here the slide shows the relationship between what you can see in the local menu, that is if you right-click on a cell in the case information display, and then how the same functions are organized in the case information toolbar. Simulator also allows you to create custom case information displays, which are spreadsheet-like displays like the other case info displays, except for you can select exactly what you want to show inside there. You can also mix and match fields from different object types or different objects and orient them basically any way that you want. So to get to it, we'll switch over to Simulator and we'll select the custom case information from the Model Explorer. So in the Model Explorer, scroll down until you see the case information and auxiliary group. If it's collapsed like this, you can just expand it by clicking on the plus. And then go to Custom Case Information. And then if we select that, then it'll bring up basically a blank sheet. And there are 4 different modes here in the custom case information display. The first one is the define fields and strings. And this is the mode where we basically just tell it what we want to show and where we want to show it here. Change field data is the mode where you're actually then interacting with the case information display, and you can use it like any other case information display. The show fields primary and show fields secondary are basically ways to bring up an XML-like tag to define each of the fields that you've shown, and we'll see those in a minute. So if I want to add something to the display, I need to be in this define field string mode, and then I can come up here anywhere in the display and just double click on a cell that I want to add a field to. So for example, maybe in cell B3, I can double click in there, And then I can pick basically any element type or any object type, and then any specific object within that type, and then pick a field. So for example, if I wanted to show the voltage at bus 1, I could choose element type bus. Then over here on the right I could select bus 1, or I could click on whichever bus I want to specify. I can only pick one. And then down at the bottom I choose which field that I want. So with the drop down list I can choose that, and if I start typing in voltage, then I can see all the different voltage fields right here. And if I keep scrolling down, I can see the per unit magnitude of the voltage. And so I can check that. I can specify how many digits to show and how many digits to show to the right of the decimal, and then whether or not to include the units in the field. So in addition to the drop down box, there's also this find dialog, which brings up this familiar dialog for choosing fields. And again, they're grouped by different types of fields and so forth. So I'll hit cancel, and then I'll click OK. And that'll put the value right in there. It shows that it's 1.02 per unit. In other cells, maybe I just want to put in some descriptive text. So maybe right here I'll just type in bus 1 volt magnitude, and then hit enter when I'm done. So if I just want to type text in, I don't need to double click. I just select the cell and then I can start typing. So maybe, and I can resize the column widths and things like that as well. So maybe on this sheet I also want to put the megavars that's coming out of the generator at bus 1. So again, if I want to define a particular field like that, I double click in here, and then I'll choose generator, and then I'll choose the generator at bus 1 with the unit ID 1, and then I could find the field if I want, and megavar output is the type of field that I want, and it's the actual megavar output. I could put that in, or I could put in different fields like the maximum megavars it could increase or decrease. Of course, there's all kinds of fields in here. You can explore the entire list as we looked at earlier when we exported the fields to Excel. But anyway, I'll just click OK here and click OK here, and I could type in some descriptive text too, like Gen 1 mvar output, and then hit enter. So anyway, the beauty of the custom case information displays is it allows you just to mix and match the data in here that you care about. So if there are certain quantities that you want to keep an eye on, you can basically create a custom case information display that shows only those quantities of interest, and it shows everything on one page. So for example, you don't have to keep switching between a bus case information display and a generator case information display. Maybe you got some area data that you want to show on here as well. You can just put it all in one spot. I can treat this pretty much like a spreadsheet in Excel if I want to. I can insert a new sheet, and I can give it a name. I'll just call it sheet 2, but I can call it whatever I want, and then it becomes another tab inside this custom case information display, and I can create new fields on this sheet if I want. I can also delete sheets. If I right click on the sheet, I can bring up a local menu which includes a lot of these same options. So I can delete the sheet, confirmation dialog pops up, I can choose yes, and so on. So when I've defined and set up the sheet the way I like it, I can switch to the change field data mode, And then this allows me to interact with it just like I would any other case information display. So fields that are enterable will show up in blue in this case. Toggleable fields would show up in green, and I'd be able to toggle them. But the bus voltage magnitude, it shows up in blue. I can change this if I want just by typing. Of course, when I go to save the case, it's gonna solve the system state, and that number might change. But for now, I can type it in and initialize it however I want. So the couple other modes that are shown down here, the show fields primary. If I choose that, it basically gives me an XML string using the primary key fields to define the data that's shown in here. So in this case, it's saying that it's a bus object, and the value of key 1 is 1. Key 1 is being the bus number. And then there's an XML tag to signify that it's the end of the key 1 string. And then it shows some variable names, the bus per unit volt, how many digits, and things like that. These are basically made available so that if you want to set up or define the fields using XML or using some database or SQL server to generate text strings, or something in Excel, for example, to generate these text strings, then you can copy them and then paste them into the custom case information display. Then the show field secondary is basically the same thing, except for it's using the secondary key field being the bus name and the nominal KV instead of the bus number. So then back to the slide. Again, here's just an example of a custom case information display. And this describes the different modes, the fact that you can always add, rename, or delete sheets. You double click in a cell from the define fields /string mode to be able to add data. Actually, you can do it from these other modes as well. You just can't do it in the change field data mode. And this shows an example of creating different types of fields. You can enter data or model fields. This is the actual case data. And then just plain text. You can type to enter whatever you want there. And then in the change field data mode, you can actually then interact with it as you can with any other case information display. And then the show fields primary and the show field secondary. And then of course the custom case information display has a local menu, some of which is similar or identical to the options that you find in other case info displays. But then there's also this specific item, this custom case info menu, which then points to certain options on the local menu which are only pertinent to the custom case information displays. So this concludes the topic under case information displays. If you need further assistance, please feel free to look us up on the web, give us a call, send email to our support line, or if you prefer to work with a particular Power World engineer, please feel free to contact that person directly.